J.J. Watt chose the Arizona Cardinals, I could argue they have the fourth best coach in the division. I could argue they have the fourth best roster in the division. And my argument is he and his wife, Kalia, they may have just said, you know, you don't have to have a second home if you live there. It's a good place to work out in the offseason. It could have been that simple, that it was quality of life stuff. I mean, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I think that, I think you talk about J.J. Watt. He's a thoughtful guy, and it is about him, and it's about his wife. It's about her career as well as his career. But I would say this, like, the teams that were reported offering J.J. Watt, Tennessee, Indianapolis, and Cleveland. And I would say this, which of those quarterbacks has the highest potential ceiling? If you're going to go play with one of those quarterbacks, first off, you go to Arizona, you're already reunited with DeAndre Hopkins, a buddy of yours, right, that you played in Houston with. So you've got some familiarity there. You've got the two best, sack artists in the game over the last decade in J.J. Watt and Chandler Jones. And you've got a quarterback that has an incredibly high ceiling.
Yeah.
So I would say of the teams that seem to be offering, because we all thought, hey, Green Bay or Kansas City, but if they weren't in the mix and those were the teams offering you, I can make a very compelling argument that at 8-8 last year, with those added additions, you have the best chance of actually being competitive for a playoff run. Now, tough division, no question about it, but a lot of questions in that division with Stafford coming over to Los Angeles, and obviously with what's going on in Seattle with Russell Wilson. So I think I can make a compelling argument that those teams that were offering you the best chance to win and win big is in Arizona.
So Dak Prescott, story yesterday, Jane Slater says he wants respect. He wants Patrick Mahomes money. And I said earlier, I think we're going from dependable Dak to slightly delusional Dak. What do you make on these new reports that he's not budging and he wants Patrick Mahomes money?
Well, I would look at this situation with Dak Prescott and say, what were you doing 2 years ago? I mean, if we look back at Jimmy G, you were just talking about Jimmy G. Remember when Jimmy G signed his contract and all of a sudden it was like, oh, can you believe they're spending that kind of money on Jimmy G, a former second rounder? And what are they doing? Now that contract is a bargain. And I look at Dallas, the last 2 years shuffling their feet, not getting a deal done, throwing out, the news to hit the news cycle. Like, can you believe what he's turning down? Like, I look at this and I completely pin the whole thing on the Dallas Cowboys. You didn't take care of your quarterback. And I know you don't want to spend top dollar for your quarterback, but if you'd have spent it 2 years ago, guess what? He'd be a bargain right now. And you were unwilling to do it 2 years ago, and you've put yourself in this position. I don't blame a guy for wanting to maximize his value. And the value out there for quarterbacks, we've seen it, right? I mean, Matthew Stafford's played 12 years in the league, has been to the playoffs. He's never won a playoff game. He's been to the playoffs a handful of times. And they traded him for 2 first-rounders. So you tell me what the value of a quarterback is. I mean, obviously, in a quarterback-starved league, it's huge. So I don't blame a guy for trying to maximize his value.
I want to ask you, the draft is coming up, and, you're not some draft specialist. You don't claim to be. But I have this – Zach Wilson's the new hot guy. And people are now saying, hey, he's not that far – from Trevor Lawrence. Mm-hmm. And so I remember the first time I saw Zach Wilson play, it was against Utah, and he lost. And Kyle Whittingham's a defensive coach. And then the second time I saw him, he played the University of Washington, Chris Peterson, defensive coach, and he got blown out. And the third time I saw him, he played Utah again, and he lost worse. 0-3 against top 25 teams. His bowl wins are over, directional schools. And every time I watched him play a great defensive coach or a really high-end team, he lost. But yet, and by the way, he was kind of meh as a freshman, meh as a sophomore. This year he popped. And I think to myself, well, my eyes told me against the good teams, he can line up and play with the big boys. I never saw him line up and go toe-to-toe and beat the big boys. Am I making too big of a deal out of that? And go back to your career, because you came from a smaller school. Mm-hmm. Or should I look at a college kid who every time I watched him against the big boys, frankly, wasn't very special? What do you make of that, using your career and what you've seen?
Well, I would go back to roster building and how important is your roster. And, we always downgrade a guy because he didn't play against great competition, right? Because he played at a smaller school. But I would always look at that situation and say, hey, man, He's competing against those smaller schools. And when you take your school and you go against the big boys, at every position, you're outmanned. And so I'll go back to, Josh Allen. Look at what Josh Allen has been able to accomplish in Buffalo in 3 years, and look at how he steadily improved as a quarterback. And there were a lot of people saying, well, the accuracy isn't there, and he didn't compete against big schools. He played at Wyoming, when he played. So I don't look like a lot of draft nicks. I don't look at playing in a smaller school as detrimental to a guy's development. I look at his skill set. I look at his arm talent. I look at his footwork. I look at his presence in the pocket, his accuracy down the field. And I think all those things are really good. And a lot of times what ends up happening is when you play at a smaller school with lesser athletes on the outside, man, you have to make accurate throws, like big time, tight windowed throws. And when you play at a school where you only face light competition 2 or 3 times a year, you don't. And what's open in the NFL, like what's wide open in the NFL, is completely covered in college. Like that's a shocking reality for most quarterbacks who leave college and come to the NFL. The coach is like, you got to throw that ball. And like, well, he wasn't open. And the coach is like, no, he was wide open. And I think smaller school guys sometimes have a better adaptability at those things when they come into the NFL. There's less of a window to adapt to that.
That was pretty good. You kind of shot my theory down all the heck. My theory doesn't mean anything anymore. You just blew it up. No, it's a good point with John, because I look at him, and I watched him against Utah and Washington, and I was like, I don't really see it. I mean, he's talented. You can tell he's an NFL player, but the Josh Allen stuff's good. Well, thanks for blowing up my argument there. I really appreciate that. All right.
My pleasure.
Good seeing you, buddy. Mark Schlereth.
Likewise.
You bet. Matt